Hey, folks, welcome to a new episode of the Whiskey Ring podcast. Today we're going to a state I haven't tried yet, a state I have not been to either for whiskey, for beer, and I don't think I've traveled there either now that I think about it. We're going to Idaho. You may not know a lot about Idaho other than the potatoes. There is a lot more to Idaho to discuss, and today we're really talking about Warfield whiskey out of Sun Valley Distillery in Ketchum, Idaho. So to talk about that, we've got Alex Buck. He is one of the co-founders and now the managing distiller and partner at Warfield in Sun Valley. So Alex, welcome on.
Thanks so much for having me. And yeah, you should come out to Idaho. It's a beautiful state.
I've been very close. We've done, Montana, Wyoming, and that kind of corridor, and I just didn't pop over the border like when I was in Yellowstone or anything. I should have, but I didn't.
Yeah, when we moved here, people would say Iowa or they'd say Ohio, and I'm like, no, Idaho. It's next to Washington and Oregon, and they'd say there's a state next. Okay. Although I guess we're now like one of the fastest growing states in the nation, so maybe more people will know about it.
That's true. Not part of flyover country anymore. There's a lot more people going.
Yes.
I think you've got no state tax there, so it's a little.
No, we have state tax. It just happens to be slightly lower.
Okay, well that'll be enough sometimes if you want it a little cooler than Arizona or Florida.
Yes.
So before I ask you the origin story, I did just want to clarify one thing for listeners. So the whiskeys and the gin, actually, it's under the Warfield Distillery and Brewery name, but the distillery itself is called Sun Valley. So do you still go by both? Is it somewhat interchangeable?
I would say for the brand perspective, it is just Warfield. Sun Valley Distillery is the the LLC that owns the brand. But once again, if somebody referred to it as Sun Valley Distillery's whiskey, that's totally fine, as long as they're picking up the right one.
Fair enough. All right, so for the purposes of this interview, I'm probably going to say Warfield more than anything, just because that's the names on the bottles.
Please do.
So with that, I'll throw it over to you for the origin story of Warfield Distillery.
Perfect. Well, let's see. It started so many years ago. It's got probably close to 26 years. My wife and I, we, absolutely love spirits and beer. It kind of started as a hobby for me as far as making beer, and then moved into distilling, and really just kind of, I always liked the European styles. I always loved Scotch. And over the years, we, things just kind of progressed to the point where my wife and I said we wanted to get out of California because we were in California, and we had twin 2-year-olds, and we said, where are we going to go? And so we picked a mountain spot, and Idaho just happened to be the one that won out over all the other states. And we wanted to start a distillery, make kind of a change in our careers. And so we started a brewery, distillery, restaurant. I was the head brewer, head distiller, also mistakenly managing a restaurant, which I would not recommend that for anybody. But, and my wife was helping with all those kinds of things, and had a business partner, a good friend of ours, and we wanted to make something that was, I guess it sounds weird to say, educational to some degree, because we've tended to pick styles that weren't necessarily the ones that people were making. So on the beer side, for example, like we just didn't make an IPA. Mostly because I just said, everybody's making IPAs. Let me try to make something different. And on the spirit side, it was really this desire that we were in the mountains. We were in the highlands, the Idaho highlands. And I thought, gosh, we have all this barley that's being grown in the Bellevue Triangle for Coors and Budweiser. Why would I go and pick corn and start making bourbon? And that's what most micro distilleries were doing back in 2014. And we were on a 210 gallon pot still, a 10 barrel system. So 310 gallons. So it took us a long time to make whiskey, but we made the choice to make essentially a Scottish style whiskey. And that's sort of just kind of my love and what I always gravitated to. So we started this thing, of course, our whiskey, because we didn't age it in new cooperage. It was whiskey made with barley mash, just a beautiful phrase because we couldn't call it American single malt at the time. And so we started putting those things away slowly, because it would take us approximately 2 weeks to make a single barrel, just because it was so labor intensive on our 210 gallon pot still, copper pot still. It was made by the still maker out of Olympia, Washington. And so it was this kind of strong desire to focus on quality ingredients. So for example, everything was certified organic. We wanted to focus really kind of on what was grown in our local area, and then also tap into the fact that, for me, it was more of an experimentation, but being at altitude and just the significant angel share. And what we discovered, which, sort of happenstance, is once we released our first whiskey at 3 years of age, we sort of just picked that based on, the fact that the Scots and the Irish don't release anything, but before the 3-year mark. What we discovered is just that it was sort of almost speed aged. We had people who likened our 3-year, at the time, the organic single malt that we released to a 12-year Glenlivet, which of course made me laugh because I just like, gosh, if I, that's a fine dram. And so anyway, so that's kind of how we started. And so, that was the origin story. And I could go on for hours and hours, but I'll let you maybe ask a question or two if you need to.
Got it. So as you said, part of the inspiration was also you had been traveling. And in Scotland, I think, or you had some time traveling in Scotland too, right?
Correct. Yes. We spent a lot of time. I mean, what started me on the beer side was really that my sister lived in England. And so I would go there, and I'm a big cask beer nerd. So I just absolutely love cask ales. And in particular, what I love so much about on the barley side was just the fact that you were able to obtain so much flavor from the barley and just learning about different malts. And so that sort of lend itself to why it is that I wanted to make, a single malt whiskey using 100% barley. Just because I think the fun of playing around with different malts, being a brewer, I don't know, it just adds one more bit of complexity to the mix. You
mentioned the cask ales too. At the time, I mean, in 2014, let's say, there's not a ton of distilleries really in the middle of the kind of second wave of craft distilleries opening up. A lot of them that had been around a long time were in Pacific Northwest, but many were making bourbons or ryes, even, with a few single malts that grew up and got bigger over time. But I remember in one of your interviews you said that at the time you thought about it too, that not only, as you said, there was no corn grown, or very little corn grown in the area, but that the bourbon market was already getting oversaturated. And so was the beer market, for that matter.
Sure.
So was that, ultimately, I would think you would have proven right on that, but was there still an argument to be made for making the bourbon at the time, because that would probably be the biggest seller from a consumer standpoint?
Yes, and that's one of those things where maybe it's just a stubbornness quality that I have, which is that, of course, like two things that would sell really well: bourbon and IPAs, neither of which I made. So, I kind of looked at this, our whiskey business is essentially a long-term prospect. And so I would look ahead and say, well, where is this going to be in 10 years? Where is it going to be in 20 years? And the thought being, well, I feel like bourbon is getting saturated. And I felt also too that at least in my experience, and it just, everybody has their different sort of flavor profiles and desires. But what I found a lot of times was the nuances that existed in bourbon compared to Scotch were just not there. And I found that using new cooperage tended to, club this like soft, delicate whiskey over the head with vanilla and some spice. And for me, I thought, well, I want the spirit that we work so hard to make. There's so much love that goes into making the beer, the whiskey wash, that you focus on, not only the brewing process, but the fermentation process, and then going in through the distillation process to then sort of kind of overwhelm it with these strong characteristics of new wood and new char. And so that's one of the reasons why we use the used cooperage. But, going back to that question, which is, yes, it definitely crossed my mind as far as the fact that like bourbon would have probably been something better to do as far as immediate sales. But like I said, I'm pretty stubborn that way. And I'm like, no, we're sticking with it. We're going the route of the American single malt. Eventually it's going to catch on.
Again, proven right. So we're going to come back to the cooperage, we'll come back to the barley, just to set the scene a little more, because again, first time we've spoken to someone who is distilling in Idaho. I think you are the highest distillery by elevation in the lower 48. Is that right?
Well, I believe that actually Breckenridge is the highest. I think that they're pretty darn. But we're up there. I mean, we're definitely high. We're at 5,840 feet. So at least that's where the distillery is at. Depending on who's checking elevations.
Gotcha. Yeah, I know you were higher than the Denver area ones, but figured if there was another one, it's probably Colorado. But yeah, you're right. Breckenridge, I think, has that. I think they might even have that trademarked, to be honest.
I think they might. Yeah, they probably do.
But in addition to that, so there's not a lot of distilleries in Idaho. And, it's, as far as I know, there were there might only be like 2 or 3 of you right now. One of them, Days to File, is fairly newer and took some stock. They are distilling their own, but they took some stock from a now defunct distillery. So
Yes.
as of about 2 years ago, when Warfield was purchased, you were noted in the press release as the only distillery and brewery in Idaho. I figure that must have been after the other one closed, but maybe before Days to File started up. But what else what does distilling look like in Idaho? What's the distilling scene like?
I mean, the distilling scene, we have an Idaho Distillers Association. There's a number of smaller distillers that exist, and we were the only distillery and brewery, so the combo of the two, but not the
Gotcha.
only
Okay.
distillery. But many of the distilleries that are sort of part of that, the Idaho Distilling Association, sort of operate under DR Incorporated, which is a brand that sort of actually, I think it's actually the largest distillery west of the Mississippi. I mean, they're huge in the sense they produce neutral grain spirit, and they produce some big brands. And do co-packing and things like that. And they, really, really nice guy, Gray Otley. And then we have, there's Bardonnay, it was out of Boise, and they've been going for a long time. And they sort of have like a restaurant distillery concept. And they've done really well. So we have I think a very strong distilling community. I think it's definitely can be challenging to be a smaller distiller in Idaho simply because of the fact that, we are a control state, and Idaho they try their best to work with the smaller distilleries in Idaho and to support them. And they've done a really nice job over the last few years of supporting people like ourselves. But it's still a challenge just because of the fact that you're dealing with, it's a different scenario dealing with a control state. But it's still, I think, a fairly vibrant community of distilleries and people who are interested in sort of, testing things out. I mean, you've got, I'm blanking on the name right now of oh gosh, the vodka that's made by Teton Distilling, but and the actor that, what was it? He dances.
Kevin Costner?
No, the guy that does the dancing, Magic Mike.
With Channing Tatum.
There we go. That's his.
Yeah.
It's. I think it's called Born Free. It's one of those things where like this is where I have a disconnect so much so where I watch the brand video for it. I'm like, who are these people that do this? Like, are they getting that excited over vodka? Maybe I do that over whiskey, but vodka, no.
Yeah. Was I mean, you noted Idaho's a control state, but do you feel like in even from the earliest stages of starting up, getting licensing, all the regulations you need to get through, the hoops you need to get through, was Idaho fairly favorable to distilling, or did it need to be prodded along to become favorable?
It was favorable to distilling. I think that because they make so much money on liquor sales, they actually they do encourage distilleries to be formed in Idaho. The liquor laws are still, I think that they're interesting in the way that the entities, the alcohol beverage control is, is part of the police department, and they control liquor by the drink licenses. And then you have Idaho State Liquor Division, which handles all of the state stores. And so sometimes there's not this overlap. So it becomes a little more complex about, well, what can you do if you're tasting on premise versus off premise, these kinds of things. And so it's a little bit of a challenge. But what I have found with Idaho, I mean, versus other states, is that you can call people in Idaho and they're always happy to help. I mean, it's unbelievable that, I can get a call from the head of ISLD and they'll just call me on my cell phone and be like, hey, how's it going, Alex? So it's an amazing state to be in. And I would say that actually I was initially very scared of operating in a control state, but I think that it gives us a little bit of a leg up as a smaller craft distillery because of the fact that the rules themselves can't be bent by the will of strong brands like Constellation, who were like, oh, well, I'll just saturate this market and destroy any competition. So it does level the playing field to some degree.
You've heard similar things in states like control states like Pennsylvania, where they said on one hand it's a little tougher, but on the same point, if you get in with the PCLB or PLCB, that you can be in all of their stores, or
Yes.
Their stores in half the state relatively quickly. You don't have to go through not independent, that's a bad way to put it, but like one store at a time or a couple stores at a time. So
Yes.
especially for, like you said, a smaller distillery, that's a huge win. And because you're in state, they also have the incentive to promote Made in Idaho. So
Yes.
I totally got one regulation that I heard you talk about that I'd love to hear is still in effect was that beverage alcohol manufacturers, when you started, had to have a restaurant attached. Hence why you have a restaurant. Is that still the case today?
It's not. No, they did away with that. I wouldn't say it was probably year 2. I think they didn't require you to serve food. It's a lot of it has to do with that liquor by the drink license. And so they take that incredibly seriously. You know, they don't want, you can't make liquor sales, for example, on that premises. And so you would sort of draw this line of like, okay, you can't cross over here with this bottle, for example, that you purchased from our distillery, because that's the liquor by the drink. But you no longer have to have them connected in order to do that, which is a good thing, because I as much as I love running restaurants, it's nice not to be doing that anymore.
So one other thing in the origin story is you were in an interview in 2022. So this was 4 years ago now, but 8 years in, so about halfway. And you're saying that originally you were just going to distill, and this is, to me, that's kind of despite your homebrewing background, and I think your partners at the time homebrewing background as well, but the allure and fiscal appeal of beer won out. Totally understood on that. How quickly after starting did you add brewing to the picture?
Well, it's actually, we started with brewing. It was from the very beginning, and in fact, it was the first product that we released. And funny, distilling actually took kind of a back seat to that, because it took a back seat to both brewing and running a restaurant, because we quickly went, oh, wow, this is actually a lot more work, and we can't rely on other people to do it for us. So we were kind of thrust in that. And so distilling actually took a back seat for about 6 months to a year in that initial year. And so brewing, really, for us, at least at the time, what made sense was it's the sort of volume driver and maybe cash flow while we were aging product. Because it's all, of course, our desire has always been to release the oldest that we possibly could, up into a certain point where it's, the best possible whiskey. And of course, I will retract that statement about the fact that beer is the driver, because boy, oh boy, beer is, it got heavily saturated, and post-COVID, it became incredibly difficult for breweries to sort of survive in our market in Idaho, mostly because of dealing with off-premise, and trying to make any money on canned product from a volume standpoint. So I would say at this stage, what we recognized is that brewing was maybe it didn't have the allure anymore, and so we shifted gears, moved to draft product only. We stopped canning beer and went and really focused on distilling. Obviously most distilled product takes a long time to go bad. Beer goes bad,
And I was just going to ask another question about the reception,
Yeah.
but I'm going to wait that until later. In the area that you are, so this is southern Idaho, southern half of Idaho, on the eastern side of the Boise Forest from Boise, really in kind of the center of the fattest part of the state, if you will. The climate, you're already over a mile high, but it's not quite high desert as it seems. It's like more alpine, right?
I mean, we're kind of right. The line is blurred. We're really in high mountain desert. There is alpine, so it's not quite full high mountain desert, and it's not full alpine. So we are in this, more sage, less trees, on southern slopes, things like that. So yeah, it's a unique climate, that's for sure. I mean, we're in the highlands.
Right. So that'll come back as we talk about maturation for sure. So before we get into production, normally I would talk about products at the kind of after production, but
Sure.
In this case, because you guys just went through a brand refresh earlier this year in like March and April of 2026, and there were a couple of changes that I wanted to talk about and just mention. So one of them was the Sun Valley Idaho single malt whiskey replaced the local, which was your previously kind of entry point whiskey. It was good for cocktails, for introducing people to the spirit. And the local was aged usually about 6 months or so. It was kind of sooner, a lesser aged whiskey.
Yes.
Whereas the Sun Valley is now 2 year-ish.
Yes.
So with this, as far as I can tell from the releases and from looking at the bottle itself, you're still looking at this as an approachable everyday whiskey, still mixable or drunk on its own. What about this moment made it feel like it was time to evolve from what was the local into what is the Sun River or Sun Valley whiskey?
Well, so the local was, I mean, as the name even says, it was designed really for our local community. We designed it, and in particular for our bar. Running a bar ourselves and having a cocktail program, it always would pain me to think like, wait a minute, I'm missing out on the ability to not only generate revenue at the bar using our whiskeys that we could mix, but also on the distillery side that I can sell this product in. And so we, the way I looked at it is like, okay, this is my opportunity to sort of test out, playing around with new cooperage and different char levels to see sort of what the effects were on, let's say, a very young whiskey that was going to be mixed into cocktails. And I would say that on a 6-month scale, and, it was like 6 to 8 months probably when we would harvest these things, sometimes a year, I think that it still was super young. I mean, there's, no doubt I would taste it and be like, okay, that's a young whiskey, but it was designed specifically for our bar. And so when I ended up selling to the new owner, Steve, the discussion was, well, he loved the local. I think that the characteristics of the new cooperage kind of shine through that, because the spirit itself it's a, delicate, oily spirit, but it's, it does do well in that new cooperage. It was this idea in my mind that I said, look, we really want to have something that's a greater age, and also, too, that's more accessible from both a consumer perspective, understanding the difference between, or the blending of kind of, let's say, the bourbon lovers that are used to the flavors of new cooperage and American single malt, but with enough age on it that you're going to start tasting, it's going to taste more like whiskey and less like that sort of, tequila, let's say, that's got that youthful sort of like, well, that's an interesting flavor. And so that's really why we ended up doing that. Because Sun Valley, that is our area, and people do know it. They know that less than they know Ketchum, Idaho, even though it's the town that we're in. And so that was really the place. It was kind of we wanted to swap that out so that we had that connection for people, so that this could be their sort of entry level. It's the gateway drug, right? I shouldn't say drug. Gateway whiskey.
And one other thing actually, before I forget, because you said the word tequila, as my desk is overflowing with bottles at the moment. So the bottle, and there'll be pictures of this, obviously, with the tastings, does to me evoke a bit of a kind of tequila essence in it. It's like that glass, textured, embossed glass writing on the back with kind of earthy tones to it. Even the glass itself is not, it's hard to tell here.
Yes.
It's not a perfectly clear glass. It has a little bit of a greenish tint.
Yes.
Was that something that you were aiming for in this rebrand, is to kind of evoke that thought?
It wasn't. I would say that, it is actually, the bottle itself was made in Mexico from recycled glass, which is, I think, pretty cool. And we wanted to have something that was a little more organic, that kind of evoked some of the mountainous characteristics that I grabbed mine. It's like the sort of the waviness, kind of ice, snow, things like that we were pulling from. And I like the feel of it. Our designer, Chad Michael, designed this bottle, and designed it in particular to be really tall, which I'm not a very tall person. So I was like, yes, let's make it as tall as possible. But yes, no, I could see that though. And I actually like the color. I like the color of the glass. I think it's just kind of interesting the way that it does. It's not green, but it's definitely, yeah. I mean, it's like there's a hue to it that I like, a smoky quality to it. But I could totally see where someone would say it's tequila-esque.
And so one other thing that the release said, and then we'll get into the full production, is that at the time of the releases, this was just a couple months ago in April, that you were using 100% Idaho grown barley and mountain water. The only question I had on that was, because you said the Bellevue Triangle grows a lot of barley, so you get that from there. Does this exclude your peated malt?
Yes, it excludes the peated malt. Correct. Yes. Peated malt comes from Scotland, so it's made by Crisp.
Right. That's what I had heard. And I know when you started up, the availability of especially smoked malts was pretty limited anywhere.
Well, and they were also, yes, and quality wise, you could never guarantee that one bag was going to be the same as the next. And, you could have some really off flavors. So yeah, sticking with people who've been doing it for, centuries is probably a good idea.
And look, McCarthy's still does that. And that's the reason they do it. It's good quality stuff. And I've stopped talking about this a bit because I went onto a really deep dive at some point, but I'm sure there is peat in Idaho and in surrounding areas. There's just too much water for there not to be peat. Yeah. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you can harvest it. Doesn't necessarily mean it's good tasting when you volatilize it, so, or pyrolyze it. That's what I was thinking of, but still not a guarantee anyway. So anyway,
Yeah.
with that, jump into production. So you've got 3 stills. You have the 210 gallon still that you mentioned earlier. That was your original still. Now it's been converted to your gin still, and you've got 2,000 gallon, to be clear, stills from Forsyths. And so when did you bring on the double still setup in addition to the 210 still?
So that would have been 2020. So around first production on those was around March of 2020.
Okay, so I mean that's a big step up from, also auspicious time, but big step up from.
It was a lovely time too.
Yeah. There's so much that happened in these interviews. I'm thinking now in like January to April of 2020 across so many different brands, everyone was growing, and then suddenly this little thing happened.
Yeah. So, it was a remarkable time where I'm like, I'm sorry, what'd you just say is happening? We're going to open our brand in our new facility in June.
Right. You said earlier, when you were dealing with just the 210 gallon still, it would take you 2 weeks to fill a 53 gallon barrel. And you were committed from the beginning to using only 53s, none of the smaller barrel formats.
Yep.
Now, suddenly you get these 2 1,000 gallon stills from Forsyths, and they're pretty good size. They're sized in between Glenmorangie and Macallan in terms of their height. So you get not the super light spirit that you would get from the Glenmo, not the super oily spirit or heavier spirit you get from Macallan, but somewhere in between those two. This is a big jump up from 210 gallon and from 2 weeks to fill a barrel. Now you could fill a couple of barrels a day at least.
Yes.
If you were, assuming full operational capacity.
Sure.
In terms of the spirits that are going to be in the bottles today, I think time-wise, that means we now would have crossed into mostly tasting stuff from the 1,000 gallon stills. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. Yeah. So everything that's in the current bottles are from the Forsyth stills. The stuff that we have aging, so I was just looking at some of our aging stuff, that are 7, 8 years old, 9 years old. Those are all from the old 210 gallon still. And
you've still got the oldest barrel, I think your first one, that's approaching 11 and a half years old now.
Yeah, we actually, and funny enough, we don't actually have, because because the production was so limited at that time, we've gone through everything except we have barrel number, I think it's number 5 or 6 is the oldest one. And it's a little over 9.5 years old.
Okay. So,
yeah,
some people hang on to that first barrel, like it's basically until it's dry. For one reason or another, sentimental reasons mostly, or just to see what happens to it after all that time. But for you though, it doesn't sound like that was necessarily the point.
Well, it was one of those things where we're like, well, let's see, do we take another 40 cases and try to sell these things, or do we hold on to it and move it around some more? But yeah, so no, I still have I think a bottle or 2 in the library of the very first release that we had, and so I haven't tasted it recently. I should really go and try it. But it's interesting too, because that the 210 gallon still, I mean, the neck on that thing is like, I mean, it's probably 4 or 5 inches. It is so small. And, so when we first did it, my plan was to just distill twice. And so on the second run, I tasted it and I was like, no, we can't make any cuts. We just go on through. So the ones that we had originally were more Irish in style, in the sense that they were 3 times distilled. And funny enough, at one point we were trying to buy barley from down south in Bellevue, unmalted, but our equipment, I could just never get the barley to gelatinize in, with our current setup. I could never get the water hot enough. It was, it just never worked. So we tried that. I think I want to say barrel number 1 or 2. It might have been 2. It took us something like 3 or 4 different batches, because our efficiencies were so terrible using this unmalted barley that, we're like, wow, this is not going to work. We're abandoning it. But we were getting this unmalted barley for like 4 cents a pound. It was just something ridiculous. Had I been able to make it work, it would have been a win.
At that price, you just kind of have to try it, I guess.
That's at the beginning stages. I mean, we're on this like 10 barrel Chinese system. like wouldn't drain, for example. Like these are these things that you never, when you start buying bigger equipment and you're like, oh, wait a minute. So you're telling me that that our boil kettle doesn't drain. So I actually have to climb in after every batch and I have to use a squeegee and squeegee towards the drain. That's funny things you learn.
That I'm not gonna lie, that sounds terrible, but I'm glad you're past that.
No, it was some of the worst. Yeah, I tell you stories.
That did remind me. I usually asked this question earlier and I forgot, but as I said, and as you said too, your background originally was more in brewing. When you thought about distilling and starting up a distillery, were there people or institutions that you looked at for training, education, and inspiration on how you wanted to distill?
It was really, I simply visited distilleries and watched what they did, asked questions, that type of thing, and then researched whatever I could at the time to figure out how. And then I would just test using, these are testing, I'm not admitting anything illegal. Actually, the statute of limitations is probably passed already, so they can't get me. But just testing out these sort of theories, because I think one of the things that's so interesting is just when you start on the distillation process using sort of these like homegrown methods, distillation it can be ugly. What you taste out of the still is just like, wow, that's horrible. Like, what did I do wrong? And those kinds of things, it's like, early 2000s, I remember we had all this wine that was bad and not bad, but it was just like wine that we didn't want to drink. And so I'm like, I'm going to distill it. Let's just see what happens. And it turned out okay. It was still not great. And I was like, this just goes to show you what you put in comes out. So if you have crap going in, crap is coming out.
People will often talk about, the white dog or even the mash. It's not always potable mash that goes into the stills rather, but more and more people are making the argument. I mean, it's not something you would bottle or can for people. They're not going to enjoy it that much, but it should be good enough that you're like, okay, there are good flavors in here that are going to be concentrated, because ultimately you're concentrating it. So it's got to be, you better like the flavors that are going in, because you're just going to get more of it coming out.
Exactly. And I think that's one of the things that is, I think what I noticed, and one of the reasons why we focused the way we focused at our distillery, was that what I noticed with a lot of distilleries was that they felt as though, because I'm boiling this, it's just fine. It's not a big deal. If I'm a little bit dirty on this brewing side, it doesn't really matter. It's going to be fine once it goes through. And I'm not going to kill anybody. It seemed like that was their baseline. And it's
great
really
baseline to have.
Exactly. Isn't a great baseline. Yeah. But I mean, that's kind of what it was. Like, you go into these distilleries and you look and you're like, wow, I cannot believe you're producing in here. Like, what's going on? Like, do you not have, like, are mice in in the actual stills? And so I feel like that's where, for us, having the brewing background, which is, if you're brewing beer and you're tasting it, like, and you make a lager, if you're dirty in any way, you're going to taste it on that lager. Which is one of the reasons too why, we didn't make IPAs either, because I'm like, look, taste my beer. It's very clean. And I think that in turn comes through in our whiskeys, because, we have very high standards with respect to cleanliness of our brew house. Also on our fermentation. A lot of people just like, whatever, just let it ferment, and, the amount of off flavors that you can get just on the fermentation side. And then, of course, deciding whether you're going to be on grain or off grain, the clear wort process, which, of course, for me, I'm a strong believer in the clear wort, just because I feel like the off flavors that you can get from, over steeping or over boiling grain. I mean, those kinds of flavors can come through. So to me, the process should always be clean. So from start to finish.
I mean, that fits with the modern, let's say, post-prohibition Scottish style. It's all pot still, obviously, because it has to be per SWA regulations, but it's off grain. You're lautering it out. And there are some there's no one in Scotland doing it otherwise, because you can't. You have, if you want to call it Scotch whiskey, you have to do it that way. A couple in Ireland. I mean, we just spoke to Brendan Cardy over at Cullowen, who's doing the on grain in the pot still, but he's doing a very traditional style. He has to have an agitator in there, and
sure,
there's a little bit of scorching that he wants, but it's very controlled. And like you said, with the fermentations, like, he's doing wild fermentations, but it's, what flavors you're going to get, and you can't have too many off flavors, because there's a line, there's a balance to be struck there. So that leads to one of next questions I had for you, which was, you said in an interview, you're a pretty open book. So you're using the Lallemand Distillamox yeast. Works for you. It's does the efficiency you need. It gets the flavors you want in there. I am curious, given your brewing background, have you played around with other yeasts to see what kind of fermentations that can give for you and for the Warfield brand?
I mean, we've played around with other yeasts. I would say there was, oh gosh, it's M1 is another one that we've tried. I think that's Fermentus. These are all based on my memory, which is, failing. But in general, we've played around. I think that the biggest issue that you have with a lot of the yeast is just that, we played around, for example, with an organic yeast, because when we were certifying whiskeys organic, you have to use it. Everything has to be 95 or above organic. And so if you're using, for example, the yeast has to be organic as well, but there really is no commercially available organic yeast. And so we played around with some stronger ale yeasts that were organic, but the fermentation, once you get above that sort of like 12, 13, you start to stress out those types of beer yeasts. And so they become very unhappy and also may not finish. So you have some residual sugars that remain, which can cause problems not only on the boil up, but also too in just your yields and the amount of time that you spend brewing. So it's one of the reasons why we kind of fell back on a traditional, distillation type of yeast that Lala makes, but just because of the fact that that this thing is going to be able to push through some of those higher ABVs. And so because we're pushing, 12 to 13% on those, on our whiskey wash at this stage. And I think that, with some of the beer yeast that we've tried, it tends to be that you'd get, around 9 to 10%, and then you just would never reach terminal gravity. You're just like, and that's it, you're done. And you'd be sad, and you try to encourage them, and you'd oxygenate them and be like, you can do it, guys, you can do it. And they're like, no, I can't do it. Which is the reason why we play around with grain. So that just the idea of being able to add, different malts and things like that. But I mean, like you said, I think that there's so much room for testing and experimentation with respect to yeast, because of course that's a huge flavor profile in itself.
Right. My question went right out of my head there. Well, actually, I'll go in this direction. You said you were doing organic for a while. I think it was part of the rebrand, but correct me if I'm wrong here, that you did drop the IDAHO organic seal. It wasn't just for the yeast purposes, though. It was also for the barley.
It was for the barley, yeah. So it's, what we decided, or at least I should say, with the team. So we had this choice, which was that when Steve came on 2 years ago, we had this decision to make, which was to say, okay, are we going to stick with organic, or do we want to move to a different grain? And I think I was leaning towards using non-GM. So it was the fact that you can't buy organic unless we had a particular farmer grow it for us, organic non-GM. And I felt as though, particularly when looking at growth within the United States of the American single malt, but also going out into other countries, that the idea was, okay, if we really want this to be, let's say, an international brand, we need to be thinking about that, simply because, they've eliminated in Scotland and Ireland, and really in mainland Europe. And so that was kind of the reason why we moved in that direction. So technically, the IDAHO Highlands, as an example, is made with organic. That's a certified organic whiskey, but it's technically, I didn't actually certify that particular label, but the liquid itself was part of the certified organic stuff that we had, and the peated is 50%, but the Sun Valley is all non-G.
Gotcha. This is working great for my structure here, because this is flowing wonderfully. So that kind of answers a question that I had, which was for your core single malts, I think you're using a mix of like 2-row barley, Crystal 60, and chocolate malt. For the peated, obviously that's going to be 50% and 50% as opposed to that. But so is the 2-row Crystal 60 chocolate malt mix really just for the IDAHO Highlands? Then the peated has a slightly different one, and then the Sun Valley also has slightly different mash bill?
So the Sun Valley, we've moved everything to the same mash bill for the IDAHO Highlands now and the Sun Valley. And so the Sun Valley just happens to be aged in, new cooperage at char 3s and 4s. And the reason being that, a lot of the aging stock that we're making, we harvest for Sun Valley, and then some we harvest for Idaho Highlands, depending on, what age they're going to be at. And then the peated is one, and we can talk about the peated, in general. This was something for me that it was kind of a pet project that I wanted to do. And of course, at the time, my choice anyway. But, it's something that I wasn't really sure. Most people, when you talk to them about whiskeys, unless they love whiskey, don't like peated whiskeys. And so this was sort of one of those things where a lot of times I'd make things for myself and my wife, we're like, we're making this for us because I like peated whiskeys. And, in general, it's been, I'm really happy with the way this one turned out. I'll probably make some adjustments, for example, to the mash bill on that. And so that'll probably be a combination of, once again, the heavy peated malt, but then we'll probably mix in not just 2-row, but it'll be probably some darker malts as well.
I remember you saying in an interview where you were a fan of those heavy peated malts, but you wanted something, I think the words you used were like more approachable for general whiskey drinkers, maybe getting into peat, or American drinkers who weren't as familiar with peat. So general, thereabout, what do you feel like the peat level for a gently peated is? And that can be kind of more qualitative. It can be in ppms, whatever you prefer.
I mean, so I would say, honestly, the ppms, I wonder, actually, I haven't even done the calculations on where the ppms would be, but, from just what I was going for is the peated whiskey made by Tobermory Distillery on the Isle of Mull, which is a Litchik. And that it was sort of, I think it was actually when I was touring that distillery, and it was a distillery that for me just like tugged on my heartstrings, mostly because I had gone through some of the big ones. And of course, everything is like, there's a guy at a computer screen who's like, transfer whiskey wash to still number 10, and you're like, wow, that's just, you just did that. That was it. And you go to Tobermory Distillery and there's still like hoses everywhere. And it's kind of a cluster, but you're like, this feels real. Like what we were having to do, where we're like moving stuff around. And so as he was describing their peated whiskey, which of course I love, there was this that, he described as autumnal smoke. And I just remember thinking to myself at the time, because it was in September, that I was like, wow, you're right. It is. And this is what I would like. And so for me, the idea when, we were looking at Crisp's offerings for peated malts, I looked and I thought, okay, a heavy peated malt. I don't want to have the, people being like, this just tastes like a burnt tire, Alex, that kind of thing. And I was like, okay, how do I obtain that? And so it was really, this was, I would say luck, in the sense that I'm like, well, you know what, let's just go 50-50. Let's just try that and see where it ends up. And surprisingly, it was really still very peated. I think that it mellowed a little bit in barrel, funny enough, which I would have expected the opposite. And so I think that it was just interesting just to carry forward, for example, like whiskeys that came in after, you could removing that smoke from both the brew house and the stills was more complicated than I had anticipated, because it does love to stay, which is probably the reason why it's like you go into a bar where they used to smoke and you're like, wow, I smell like an ashtray and I can't get rid of it, and it's on everything. So anyway, so yes, that was I would say the analysis that I did on the peated was essentially trying to match a whiskey that I loved.
Litchik it's one. It can go either way for me. And we had this conversation, I think, with Sukhinder Singh a couple weeks ago, is that it can be really, sometimes it can come off a little bit like dirty peat in a way. Other times a little cleaner, and that inconsistency can be gorgeous. That can really elevate the experience. And when you're doing it by hand, you get those inconsistencies that are a lot of fun. I do tend, from that distillery though, more to the Deanston line, but that's just me.
Okay.
I like the peated stuff too. I love the Deanston with the different finishes that they have sometimes. It's relevant. Anyway, so back to Warfield and Sun Valley. So with maturation, you go through the stills and putting into the 53-gallon barrels now, mostly ex-bourbon cask, some sherry in there. Do you have a preference for bourbon barrels?
I would say when we started, it was really anything that would hold liquid, because when you're when you're buying in smaller quantities and you're trying to figure out like, okay, well, who has good barrels? And at the time I remember thinking it was more difficult to find barrels, in smaller quantities, right? Because a lot of times like, oh, I need to get rid of 300 barrels. I can't sell you 8, kind of thing. And so initially it was what holds and what can I keep, us, filled with enough water that it's going to stay hydrated. Because of course it would take us a long time to be able to go through, let's say 4 to 8 barrels. And so that was, what I found was that Four Roses and Heaven Hill tended to be probably the best construction as far as holding the longest term. And so we've pretty much held to that. I mean, we have some like Castle and Key made some really good ones too, that we still like, move through our stock. But in general, it's going to be falling in that sort of Four Roses, Heaven Hill, and then maybe a smattering of Castle and Key, depending on if, Scott connects me with the people it gives me some.
I mean, that presaged my next question, was going to be like, are you at a state now, capacity-wise and production-wise, where you can be picky about which ones are available? It sounds like you can a little bit now.
I mean, we can be. I mean, we can be pretty picky. The distiller, our head distiller, Andy, he does a lot of the barrel picking, and he's one of those guys that what I love so much about Andy is that he's kind of a stickler. So he yells. I don't do a lot of yelling, but he can just be like, no, this is junk. Don't send me this stuff. And so I love that about him. But in general, yeah, we can be a little pickier simply because we buy in larger quantities now, because when we, the way that we currently fill, we have when I owned it, it was we had a 800 gallon blending tank. And so we'd fill off of there, which would be, let's say, call it 15, 20 barrels. And so then what we moved to be simply because of just the sheer volume that we were doing, we fill totes. So we fill the blend, then it goes into totes, and then we fill off the totes. And so we'll fill, it's probably like sometimes 50 at a time, type of thing. And so it's a significant number of barrels that you got to bring in and sort of manage. So we do have the ability to at least request, better barrels, but still not quite big enough, right?
I mean, if you're able to pick them, that is to me a mark of the scale you've achieved. If you're not at a point anymore where you're just like, whatever is there, we got to take it. That's a good mark for me. So the distilleries who are then still in that other one, they make it work, no doubt about it. But I know distilleries tend to have a preference once they can get that preference to stick with it. So that's kind of the genesis of the question there. You also said with the maturation, your preference, oddly enough, not typical of Scotch whiskey, your preference is more of a rickhouse style maturation, but you do a mix of rick and dunnage. So for you, what does the rickhouse versus dunnage do for the whiskey?
I mean, so I guess that's a tough question for me. I would say that in general, I find that when I think about our scale and our size and the things that are really aged, I found the rickhouse model seemed to work really well just from, it may just be that a lot of the stuff is just, we don't have quite the amount of aged product at this stage to really be able to tell. So, I would say that, being at altitude, what we've noticed is that in the rickhouse, and of course we've moved things around so much, that it seemed to be that, we don't go very high because we can't from a fire standpoint. And so things do age pretty evenly. And in general, we're even getting a percentage as far as loss is also something that's kind of interesting that I've not been able to fully nail down yet. So, yeah, I don't really have a good answer for that one, truthfully. Yeah, I don't really have a good answer for that one.
That's right. You again presaged another question, which was, have you had enough time with your whiskeys, I'll say in this era of the 1,000 gallon stills to see what a difference in rick or dunnage might do, but more about the climate there. So without the angel share percentage conversation necessarily, what do your rickhouses look like? So you said it's doing a mix of them, but do they generally?
Well, I would say that in general, like the stacking, I would say, because we don't have traditional ones where we've got like, multiple floors. So, for us, we're using racks. And so the racks can go 3 high, but we also have stuff in, on pallets. So we have a palletized sort of, Rick, I guess is, I would say it almost in the sense that what we have, our standard is pretty much going to be on the dunnage side where you're looking at like 2 or 3, high kind of thing. And the palletized go 4 to 5, but I have, like I said, I haven't really had the time to see whether or not there's a significant difference between those, mostly because of just the scale. We've always had them like I can reach up and touch them. So that's why I would say it's harder for me to answer that question with respect to it, because, our structure is such that it's really about accessibility of our barrels, simply because we've got a lot more, but when, for me, a lot of the old age product, which we keep really close, they're still at eye level almost. And so they don't tend to have a huge difference. Not like, let's say a, Kentucky rick house that's like, oh, well, on floor number 4. No,
And if I'm doing the math right, I think you'd be about like between 3,000 and 4,000 ish barrels a year. Like I'm running at full capacity, like 24/7.
That's it.
Still's always running.
Yes.
But I'm assuming you're not doing 24/7 right now.
No, we're not. We run. So we are running when let's see, year from 24. So when we were running it, we were essentially aiming for about 250 barrels per year. When Steve took over, we were doing, that year we were running 7 days, essentially 7 turns on the stills. And so now we've ratcheted that back to about 4 to 5 days on the stills. It's mostly that as we've, our head brewer, for example, Josh Strobel, he's just been able to dial in our whiskey wash in such a way that, our yields are just amazing, so that you don't really have to turn the stills quite as much. And so, so we're at the full capacity. You're right. We were the 3,000 plus barrels a year. And so right now we're probably around, 1,500 barrels a year, something like that.
I mean, it's still significant, but I hear you in that
It is.
Yeah. That reminded me of the question that went on in my head earlier, which was that the 12 to 15% ABV in the wash is on the higher end for a pre-distillation wash. Is that a factor of just the mash bill that you're using plus the barley, plus the yeast? Is there something having to do with the elevation that's letting it go a little higher too?
I mean, I would say it's actually really just the efficiency at which Josh has been able to dial in the wash. So we haven't had to, because as you know, with the brewing process, you can put in more barley and hope to achieve greater extract, and that works to some degree. But at some point in time, there's just too much barley and you can't really rinse it enough. You can't really, lauter it enough to be able to extract it, so your efficiencies actually go down. And so he's managed to get to a point where he has his efficiencies to the point where he's like, when he's brewing, that, 12 to 13.5% is doable for him. I mean, we have occasionally we'll, have a, like a weird pocket that say develops in the latter ton or something along those lines, where we don't get quite the efficiency that we were looking for. But in general, he's been really consistent. So it's really, I think it's more about, sort of the brewing methods and, his adherence to just good practices, really.
And I think that quality control, again, flowing very well for my list of questions here. You mentioned earlier that when you're evaluating a brewery, you want to try like a lager or an IPA, something that's on the lighter side. Try it by their lightest whiskey, because there's nowhere to hide in those whiskeys.
Yes.
And you'll taste all flavors. For you said in one interview that you taste samples at 25% to try to do the same thing, like find the off flavors, if there are any. Out of the barrel, if you're thieving it out of the barrel, you're obviously tasting cask strength, whatever that might be. But what is your process like for deciding when a barrel is ready based on the cask strength tasting versus going down to the 25% taste and then the eventual 92% that it's bottled at? Sorry, 92 proof that it's bottled at, 92%.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, the process for, what we end up doing is, well, obviously we pull samples, and then what I tend to do is I always taste cask strength, and then we'll end up proofing them down and obviously tasting those things to determine whether or not, one, is there consistency across multiple barrels? Because I think, tasting cask strength, sometimes I would say barrels, for example, I've tried that I'm like, wow, that's an amazing, like the nose on this thing is just fantastic. And oh my gosh, the flavor that I'm getting is awesome, from the cask strength. But as I start to proof it down, what I notice, I'm like, you know what? I don't like this current that I'm getting through here, which is going to conflict with this one over here. So, in general, that's kind of the process that we go through. It's still very manual. And I would say even to some degree, based on the fact that consistency wise, you're looking at barrels that were made over the last, we're talking 6 years, right? And at different times of the year, with different spans of barrels, even from the same distillery. And it's pretty crazy how I would say liquid going in, because of course, once again, for me, I would end up blending everything together and then barreling from that blend. That 2 barrels side by side from the same blend can taste completely different, even though they're sitting side by side in the rack. And so anyway, so the process essentially, I start with that barrel strength, and then we end up proofing it down to the 25 just to sort of see if what other flavors are we getting that we can actually taste, and then we'll try it at the 92.
Do you do any either cast strength or single barrel releases?
So we've not done a cast strength. We're probably going to do a cast strength, and the reason why I haven't is because of the fact that I think for people who like whiskey, they sort of understand cask strength and what it means. I think for the average consumer, I think they think that it means greater quality, and they don't understand that from a flavor and a tasting perspective, that sometimes is not necessarily best to drink at cask strength. And on the American single malt side, I think it can be a little more difficult for people to appreciate the spirit when it is that high, simply because they're like, whoa, what is this? This is not what I was expecting. Whereas if it's a little bit more mellow, they can actually taste some of the flavors that come through with an American single malt. I mean, people who've tasted them, like yourself, I'm sure, you can appreciate a cask strength whiskey, but I think that that's the reason why we haven't done it. But it is something that, for example, in Arkansas, we're just talking to our salesperson there. So many people want cask strength, and so we'll have something that comes out at cask strength for sure. It'll probably be a single barrel pick at some point.
And the next one that came to mind was let's start with the local reception. You've been in the community for a decade plus now. I guess to pull it back a second there, what is the drinking culture in Idaho like? Is it more of a beer state, would you say, more of a whiskey state, somewhere else?
I mean, I would say that it is, first of all, we have a significant number of Mormon people living here. So that's probably, I actually don't know what the percentage is, but non-drinkers. So a significant number of non-drinkers. And I would say that there are definitely some higher end, whiskey drinkers that exist, but it's still a kind of a burgeoning, group. In general, I find that it's mostly mixed drink culture is what it feels like. If you you can actually pull up IDAHO posts their, what they sell, and you can see, it's like, what's the number one seller? Tito's by a long shot.
Figures. Right.
So, but it's amazing because you can look and see where everything falls. And generally speaking, it's going to be the clear spirits. So I would say it's definitely much more of a mixed drink type of thing. Falling, with, on the beer side, it's going to be like seltzers and, probably, beer would be, probably light lagers, So I think that's kind of, without, I don't want to disparage, Idaho in the sense of calling it unsophisticated, because it's not. It's a very sophisticated state in a lot of ways. But I would say that from a whiskey standpoint, understanding American single malt, it's still kind of in that newer stage of understanding.
The Mormon connection is interesting in that it triggered for me this thought of, was there any carryover from the states to your west, like the Washington, the Oregon, where even Northern California, where there's such a strong beer culture, as you were saying very early in the interview, like this West Coast IPA style and all of that. But it sounds like that doesn't really carry over the border so much.
It doesn't really. I mean, IPAs are obviously, they're still, I would say for us, it was always the questions you'd get at the restaurant. What's your lightest beer? What's your hoppiest beer? Those are always the questions, nothing in between. And so it's still there, but I would say we're always slightly a little behind the coasts, but I think that's the case no matter what. The coasts tend to pick those kinds of things up. So same thing, I think, with whiskey as well.
You said that in a different interview that locally people are still somewhat surprised when they visit, because they see a distillery, they're expecting bourbon,
Yes.
Especially they see a whiskey distillery, they're expecting bourbon. And you guys don't have a bourbon. It's single malt and the gin, which I want to mention as well. but they do still try the single malt. So what has the really local reception been like, and has it changed over 10 years?
I mean, I think it's definitely changed. I would say that, people have, I mean, it's hard to say have learned to love, but it's really that I think people have come to accept the fact that it is not a bourbon distillery, but people do still, funny enough, even people that work for me in the restaurant would still call it a bourbon. I'm like, well, let's just take a step back here. It's not bourbon, remember, but in general, I think the reception has been good. And I think that for a lot of people that, especially in our town, I think, a sophisticated group of people that come from, because we're, as a ski area, so many people come from places like Chicago, New York, Los Angeles, Seattle, and they're coming in from those areas, and they know, like, okay, well, this is a American single malt. I know that. I've heard of that before. So I think the reception's been good.
Awesome. And let's touch on the gin here, which I have also under my desk here. So organic aged gin. So you guys do this was delicious, by the way. And
thanks.
That 88 proof and aged in toasted barrels. So you guys are doing something a little different here in that you do not only the botanical maceration, it's about 24 hours, I think, crushed botanicals, I should say, in the maceration, but then you distill on the botanicals as well. So
Yes.
in some ways, the flip of what you were saying about the whiskey, in that you don't want some of those off flavors from the on grain, but for the botanicals, you're going all in. Let's just distill the oils and everything that we can get out of those things.
Yes.
So what initiated your idea to have the gin in there and this particular gin expression?
So and going back to the sort of distillation side, what's interesting is that, initially it was maceration, and it was a long maceration that I would do at higher proof. And then I would remove the botanicals. And what I found was that, you'd have, I think the carryover was pretty good, but having a bar and having to mix cocktails, it was really just making sure I had a gin that could stand up to some of the stronger mixers. And so, just from a test batch, and also to trying to figure out how to mass produce on a 210 gallon still, I was thinking, okay, well, what can I do? And so I just trial and error of seeing maceration times. And what I found was that I could sort of duplicate the longer maceration times with the distillation on botanicals. And so I also found that I was able to pull out, I think that the juniper, and particularly because our still is, the column on is like super short, that, you're looking at getting so many of the oils. And I think that's one of the things that I love so much, is that you can extract even more of that flavor. And then the other question you asked is like, were you asking as far as like why this particular gin and this particular style? Is that what the question was?
Yeah.
So for me, I felt, and this goes back to just sort of a question of how we are perceived in the marketplace and who we're competing against. And so when it started, it was really, I was trying to think, okay, one, I want to make a gin that I like. And I love all gins, really. But I didn't want to necessarily say I'm going to make a London Dry gin, because, like, why would I try to compete with, let's say, Beefeater or Tanqueray? And so, of course, we're wanting to put our own spin on things. And I wanted to basically sort of achieve balance. And I think that's maybe kind of the underlying current of the Warfield, is sort of always trying to achieve some balance with respect to flavors, so that nothing is ever overpowering in particular. And so that's kind of how came up with the sort of the mash bill for the gin, where it has just enough juniper backbone that can stand up to cocktails, but still some nuance. So if you're drinking it on its own, it's very enjoyable, because like making a martini with it, for example, if you're using, sort of a 2-to-1 with vermouth, it, like, the floral nature of it comes through. And then on the barrel aged gin was really, I mean, this was just something we were like, we have barrels, we have gin, let's put them together, which, wasn't necessarily novel per se, because other people were doing it, but
Right.
it was one of those things where, like, let's just see what happens. And I think that what's so interesting to me is it is the same botanical bill and the same method. It's just our gin that we put into barrels at a higher proof. But the sort of baking spices that come out with the barrel, I think, are just fascinating to me, where everything else kind of gets muted. And that just goes to show you just how much flavor and control the barrel has over spirits, because essentially it's 100% organic, wheat. And it is, when you think about it, it's like a wheat whiskey, right? With some flavoring. And I think that's one of the things that, when I would do these tastings and tours people would go through the portfolio and I always start with vodka, then I move to gin, and then I'd get to the barrel-aged gin, and people would be like, what is this? This is amazing. And then you taste them through the whiskeys and you're like, this isn't a bourbon, blah, blah, blah. And they always go back, particularly at the time, because our price was really high, was much higher on our 3-year age whiskey, just because there wasn't a lot of it. And they'd always go back like, I think I'll buy the barrel-aged gin. So it's been the kind of like the sleeper, I think, of the portfolio in a lot of ways, because people, they taste it and they're like, this is just like, it's wild to me. So anyway, so that's kind of how it came about.
With the gin, do you do a different, for the barrel-aged gin, I should say, do you do a different barrel entry proof than you do for the whiskeys?
So the barrel entry proof on that is usually 120 proof. So it usually goes in around 120 proof on the gin. And the whiskeys, we've played around with, mostly because we've had a lot more volume, obviously, to play around with. So traditionally, I'd put it in at around 120 proof, but we've experimented with, going all the way down to like 108 proof and 115, just to see sort of the nuances that get picked up, spirit versus water and that type of thing, which I think is, to me, kind of fascinating. I mean, I'm always amazed at sort of the science, and I'm not smart enough to pick it all up.
I got you. Especially because you're doing for intents and purposes, a Scottish style whiskey in America. So you're doing the used cooperage for the most part. It would usually lend itself to that higher entry proof, just if it's typical to Scotland. But like you said, I mean, not everyone does that anyway. It could be 108, it could be 100 proof. You better have a lot of money if you're doing it at 100 proof, or it's going to cost a lot of money. But
yes.
So just in the last couple of minutes we have here, I want to talk about you and your partners have floated this idea in previous interviews, because of course you've been asked, okay, if you've done the American single malt, you've done the gin, are you going to do a bourbon? Are you going to do something else? And while there's nothing, as far as I can tell, in the fermenters to indicate this, you've said that you would most likely do a rye next, not a bourbon, if you were to expand into another style of whiskey. Why rye over bourbon?
Because I like rye better.
Simple as that.
Yeah. I mean, I think that I will say, once again, going back to where we live, and of course, people would, for example, there was a friend of mine, Scott Schiller, we were talking about rye versus bourbon. And of course, bourbon has a huge share of the market. Like, that's what people buy, right? And he's like, whereas rye represents like a very small fraction of that. And so from that perspective, it's not the smartest decision. However, when you look at where we live, rye is grown also in Idaho, and a significant amount of rye. And we have an organic rye, grower just south of us that we've bought rye from before, and made an IPA with it called the rye IPA, and it was really tasty rye. So it's just one of those things where I'm like, if I were to go that direction, just one, from my own, just what I like, and then two, just availability.
And Scott, he's at Thoroughbred, right?
Yep, that's right. Yeah.
Certain names that pop up in a bunch of different places. I'm like, no, I've definitely heard that one.
Yeah.
And then my last question for you, because we're almost out of time, is you've been distilling for over 10 years, legally, let's say, and Warfield, Sun Valley are continuing to grow. They said purchased in 2024, but still continuing to grow. You're still very much a part of the team, part of the leadership. What do you want your distilling or whiskey legacy to be?
That's a good question. One that I never even think about. I mean, I would say that my hope would be that the whiskey that we've laid down in the last, over my tenure, I guess, is one that brings great joy to people, with respect to American single malt, and that they, at some point in time, Warfield becomes synonymous with, great whiskeys. And up there where people are like, oh my gosh, yeah, I had the Macallan, but if you had the Warfield,
That's a worthy goal. And if your stills are somewhere between Glenmoe and Macallan, you're going to probably be in good company there.
Yeah.
So, Alex, thank you so much for coming on, talking about Warfield Distillery, about Sun Valley Distillery, whichever way you see it. You'll see Warfield on the labels, so Warfield's fine
Warfield
too.
it is. Yeah, no,
Warfield it is. Hang out with me for just a moment after we finish recording.
Okay.
This has been another episode of the Whiskering Podcast. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Please rate, like, and subscribe wherever you go. Let's keep those 5-star ratings going on Apple Podcast and Spotify. And I think Amazon too, although it's a little harder to find there. Please reach out if you've got any questions, or if you want some help finding Warfield Distillery. There will be links on how to follow and find them in the show notes. Thanks for listening, everybody. See you all next week.